VBS over on Thursday night, we ran right into another celebration, of course, the Buptic Festival that began on Friday. And if you've been a part of any of the events that have been taking place over the last couple days, there's been some great things going on, some great food that we've had. There's lots of participation actually from our church family in the festival and the organization and the running of it and all of the rest. This year too, Sharon and Wayne were honored as the Legends of a Buptic, and so I know you really want me to point that out, but that's something to celebrate as well. Many years of involvement, certainly in the festival there. And the Buptic Festival, of course, is a weekend that's happened every year for, I think it's 30, Jill, where are you? 38th year that it's been running. And it's really a celebration of the community and the people who are part of it. And there's a long history of events. I have read the book. I got a copy of it. Some of you might have that. That was, how many years ago was that published now? That's been a while ago, but there's some great old pictures in there and some of the events of previous years and past years and things that took place. And so a great thing this afternoon, I will just kind of put a promo piece in over at the park. There's bouncy castles for all of you who'd like to go do that this afternoon, but it's running from 1 to 3. There's bouncy castles. You can go swimming in the lake. There's some other things happening. There's food, so just come to watch and chat and talk with some others. Encourage you to do that this afternoon. Over this weekend with a Buptic Festival, it kind of took me back as well to some of my days growing up near Woodstock in kind of northwest New Brunswick, and I just noticed too they're having their Old Home Week I think it's this week, and I have lots of memories of days gone by as a teenager at Old Home Week from the fairs, mostly the fairgrounds, and riding the rides that probably aren't very safe for anybody to be on, and you know how those traveling rides are, and remembering all those things. Of course, we had tractor pulls, being in farming country, that was always a thing, and lots of things, craft shows, animal shows, all kinds of stuff like that. But even closer to home, we had probably more akin to Buptic Festival was the Waterville Days, and that festival is long past now and doesn't happen anymore, but it used to be a really big thing. And I remember was lots of parts of it, but the things that I remember most of it were the parades. We would do a regular parade, and then they had what was called the Wee Folks Parade, like for all the kids, and the kids would do their own parade, and it was a little bit shorter. I have literal trophies in a bin somewhere that I had won best whatever. There was one year I dressed up as the old lady in the shoe. Yep. I have my nan's like one of her dresses on or something. These little wire rim glasses, and I had a little wagon that my mom, I don't know what she made out of construction paper or something, built a shoe with windows, and we hung Cabbage Patch dolls out this windows. And I walked down the road like this, pulling this wagon. I don't know how long it was, but I probably wasn't the pace car for the event. I remember that one. And the other one I remember doing, me and my best friend at the time, Seth Anderson, our camping trailer was an old, I think it's an 8-foot trailer, and the whole thing was canvas, and you would, like the canvas sides and everything, and I think the canvas had rotted in it at that point, or we had just taken it off, I can't remember, but we just had the box frame of this 8-foot camper, and we built a wrestling ring out of it, and I forget who Seth was, but I think I was Macho Man Randy Savage, with the stripes on my arms and everything, and we wrestled the whole parade all the way down the thing, and like that was the best day ever. And so I don't know if we won that year or not, but those are just some of the memories that I have from those festivals growing up. And as you think about festivals, and of course with this weekend I was reflecting on festivals, and festivals are really just public celebrations or public events, public moments where people come together to celebrate something, whether that's community, whether that's music, art, film, food, faith. there's all kinds of things that festivals are held for. And those festivals are often repeated regularly, if not annually or biannually, or however often they're repeated. But they also hold special significance for those people who are involved. And as I was thinking about festivals and celebrations and the rhythms of those things in our lives, I was reminded that God is a God of festival. He very much is a God of festival. He delights in celebration, actually. God is not the stuffy shirt junior high boy who goes to the dance and sits on the bench in the back wall, while the music is playing and the floor is empty. God is a God of festival and a God of celebration, and he delights in celebration. And when he formed his people that became a nation, they were to be a light to the rest of the nations. And as a regular part of their identity, they held festivals every year, feasts that would be celebrated as a regular part of their identity as a nation, but more importantly, of their identity of God's people. And so when we turn back to Leviticus 23, I kind of laugh that, for a moment where we're going to talk about festivals and celebrations, that we would turn to the book of Leviticus. The book of Leviticus is kind of this lengthy writing about holiness codes, in particular as it relates to worship in the temple and the function of the priests in the temple, and all of the things about sacrifices and how they're to be performed and when they're to be performed, and what the proper procedure is for all of these things. And so as far as just a reading of it, it's not a kind of a light, summer afternoon read. It's very technical. There's a lot to it. There's a lot of stipulations and rules and how things are supposed to go. But when we come to Leviticus chapter 23, we find this interesting introduction to what's going to be written about. And we won't read the whole chapter today, but let me just give you the first two verses. It says this: "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, 'Speak to the people of Israel and say to them.'" Now remember, they're kind of in the wilderness. They haven't moved into the land of promise yet. There's no permanent homes, permanent structures. They are traveling nomads for 40 years through this wilderness with a portable tabernacle and all of the rest. And so God speaks to Moses and he says, "Tell the people of Israel this: these are the appointed feasts of the Lord that you shall proclaim as holy convocations. They are my appointed feasts." So what he's about to write about, and the instructions that Moses is about to be given from God, have to do with these 7 what are called holy convocations. Really, it means a set apart time for gathering together. For a holy purpose, for a set-apart purpose, for a purpose of both celebration, yes, but of identity as the people of God. That's what the holy convocation is. I don't know what you have in mind when you think of a holy convocation. If you think of sitting in silence and, praying and everybody's kind of quiet, it might not feel celebratory. I don't know if that's your view. When I think of holy convocation, that's kind of one of the first things I think of, but that's not what is in mind here. It's a set-apart moment of the coming together of God's people for a particular purpose or a particular task or for a public celebration. And there are 7 of them that get outlined as to what should happen, first of all, weekly, but then every year. These are the appointed feasts. Now that sounds a little bit more celebratory, right? The appointed feasts, and there's certainly much feasting that happens in these. There are, among the 7, some of them run together, and so theologically we'd say, yes, there are 7 appointed, and 7 things that are supposed to happen regularly and in rhythm as the identity of the people of God in their celebrations. But among them, there are really 3 main ones And the three main ones are these kind of three celebrations that were called pilgrimage festivals, where everybody was required to travel to Jerusalem 3 times a year to be a part of it. And so I'm not going to read the whole thing for us, but let me kind of just outline quickly for us what these 7 holy convocations or appointed feasts are. And I promise you, by the time we get to the end, we're going to see the importance of it. And so the first is this. It says 6 days in verse 3, shall work be done, but on the 7th day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwelling places. And so this isn't the first time Sabbath has been spoken of in the ordinances or commands of God to his people. But Sabbath was to be part of their identity as his people. To Sabbath means quite literally to cease, to stop, to rest. It doesn't mean to worship, although there is worship in the ceasing and stopping and resting. Quite fundamentally, it means to stop, to not do any more work, to shut down the laptop, to put the hammer or saw away, to tie up the nets, to stop doing your regular work for a day of rest. And that was meant to happen weekly. It was to be a time of rest and of reflection of how God works while we rest, of how our dependence and trust is in him and not wholly on ourselves to provide. It's a reminder of his goodness to his people. It's patterned after 2 things, actually, in the original commands in Exodus and Deuteronomy. The first is it's patterned after creation. The day of rest was appointed because on 6 days God created the heavens and the earth, and on the 7th day he rested. And so it's a pattern that came out of the very creative work of God himself, and that his people were to be a people whose lives are patterned after the way that God himself works. And so for 6 days you will do your labor, and on the 7th is to be a day of rest, of stopping, of ceasing, of reflecting, and being reminded of our place in the created order. But the second time it's spoken of as Sabbath, that the Sabbath is spoken of, it's spoken of in this way, that it is to reshape their identity as God's people who had come out of slavery where there was no rest. You, as my people, will be different. The life that you had before in slavery in Egypt is now being disrupted by God, who cares for you, who loves you, who works for your good. And so the day of rest wasn't supposed to be or meant to be a way of, forced stopping so that we feel stuffed in and what can't I do on this day of rest. No, it was supposed to be a liberation for the people, that you are free to stop working. And so this Sabbath rest was to be part of their regular rhythm, and not only once a week, but every 7th year the fields were to lay fallow, and every 49th year, 7 times 7, there was a pause and a break and a resetting in some ways of economic and social justice issues within society. That was the rhythm of Sabbath for God's people. So that was the first. And then follows with some others. And so if you read down through, the first one we'll come to after Sabbath is the Feast of Passover and of Unleavened Bread. Many of us are familiar with this one. It's a reminder of the deliverance of God from Egypt, where he saved his people from slavery, delivered them out of that life, and he brought them into their own land and would bring them into their own land. The Passover was to be celebrated every year on a specific date that had to do with the timing of the calendar. There was a special meal that was eaten. The original Passover, when it happened in Egypt, if you remember, there was a special meal there too of lamb. And what they did when they killed the lamb to prepare it to be eaten for this special meal, they took some of that blood and they put it on the doorposts of the houses, so that the 10th plague over Egypt, where God showed his power to Pharaoh, when the angel of death passed over, it would pass over the house with the blood and the doorposts, and there's great theological significance to that, which we'll get to in a second. But that was the time of Passover, and they were supposed to eat this meal commemorating celebrating the Passover every year. And that was followed by, with Passover, 7 days of unleavened bread, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or the time of unleavened bread. In the Old Testament, the leaven in bread often symbolized sin and evil when it's used symbolically, right? And so they would purge sin and evil from their homes. In fact, the kids, as part of the ritual, would take all the leavened bread and all the yeast in the house, and they would take it and they would throw it outside. As a reminder of we are purging the house of these things. And so they would eat unleavened bread for the 7 days. It was a call to holiness. It was a call and a reminder of being the set apart people of God whose lives and character were to be patterned after his own. It was Passover and unleavened bread. Then we come to the Feast of the First Fruits, which acknowledged the fertility of the land that God would give them. And the early crops of the spring were harvested, and there was a great feast because of this. And then after that comes the Feast of Weeks, which is sometimes referred to as Pentecost. Now, we have a different meaning of that as followers of Jesus, which again, we'll get to in a second. But the Pentecost happened 7 weeks after the Feast of the First Fruits. It came to be a symbol of the giving of the law at Sinai. That's what was celebrated. There was a grain offering made of 2 loaves of leavened bread during the Feast of Weeks. And during that time, the farmers in the land were supposed to leave the edges of their fields and of the harvest. You recall this? Where some of the crops, they wouldn't harvest right up to the edge. They would leave it for who? For the poor and the sojourner. The sojourner is the temporary resident in the land. For those who didn't have consistent work, or for those who had no work, it was again a justice issue. The farmers would leave some of their crop so that others could come and harvest what they could and what would be helpful for them. It was an issue of caring for the poor. It was an issue of compassion. It was part of the Feast of Weeks. Now, if you have been tracking with this, you might notice that Passover, the actual date of it, the month was called Nisan, not the car, the month. It was called Nisan, and it was on the 14th day of Nisan that Passover happened. The day of unleavened bread happened on the 15th day of Nisan. The next day, that's when it started. And the celebration of the Feast of First Fruits was supposed to be on the first day after the Sabbath in that calendar time frame. Does that track with anything with some of you? Yeah. Jesus was crucified at Passover into the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and on the first day of the week, the day after the Sabbath, he rose from the dead. There's this interesting pattern that we begin to find out of these feasts that God had appointed about sacrifice and justice, and his loving compassion and the identity of the people of God is now wrapped up in the story of Christ and of Easter. Let's go to the fall festivals. Now we find down in verse 23, if you're tracking with Leviticus 23, verse 23, we find the introduction to the Feast of Trumpets. This happened on the first day of the 7th month. Again, if you're finding all this kind of long and lengthy and like, what is all this? Just hold on, okay? We're getting there. Okay, so the Feast of Trumpets happened on the first day of the 7th month of the year. It was a special day of rest that was announced with trumpets, okay? And often the high priest is the one who blew the trumpet at the beginning of the day to call the people to stop work and to worship. It was this call to worship that happened with the sounding of trumpets. And then after that, the Day of Atonement on the 10th day of the 7th month. So 9 days later, the Day of Atonement happened. It was a day of confession, a day of repentance from sin. It involved this elaborate and complex sacrificial service in the temple that has to do with 2 goats, and the priest would lay his head on one and he would run into the wilderness. It was the scapegoat. right? And then the other would be sacrifice. And there was this whole complex thing that happened in the temple with sacrifices. And then the priest would go behind the curtain into the most holy place once a year to atone for his own sins, the sins of the people. And they'd sprinkle blood on the mercy seat. And there's all of this ritual and thing that happened on the Day of Atonement, which was a reminder of how God would forgive their sins. And then came on the 15th day of that same month. So the first day was the Feast of Trumpets. The 10th day was the Day of Atonement. The 15th day was the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles, where that would last for 7 days, where people would set up temporary shelters during the time of harvest. Sometimes it would be out on their balconies. Sometimes it might be in another place. But they would set up these temporary shelters, and often would actually go and sleep in these shelters for a week. Kind of like, not really, but if you were going camping, you'd sleep in a temporary shelter for the week while you're gone, right? You leave your house to do this. Well, this was an intentional act. In some way, they would set up these booths, and then they would sleep in them. Why? It was a reminder of God's provision and protection of them through the wilderness experience. When they look back to how God had delivered them out of slavery in Egypt, and they wandered for all of those years in temporary shelters, and God provided for them with manna and quail and water and all the things that they needed to survive in that wilderness. And this Feast of Booths was a celebration of harvest, yes, but also, again, a reminder of the provision and protection of God in the wilderness. And all of these festivals, all of these celebrations, all of these feasts, all of these annual things that God's people would do every year, which commemorated and reminded them of the activity of God and his faithfulness through and his love for them. These were communal, commemorative, theological, and typological. Now let me explain what I mean by that. First of all, it was communal. All of these feasts and festivals were a coming together of God's people. And it was a reminder for them of the sharing of their common origin as his people, of starting with Abraham and right through to deliverance from Egypt, to now being formed in the land as the 12 tribes and of the nation that they are. It was shared their common origin story, but also their current common identity as the people of God. It was a communal celebration. This is who we are as God's people. But it was also commemorative in this sense that it commemorated or reminded them of the story of what God had done. It kept that story alive. It was a way of retelling the story again and again and again of how God had provided, of how God was their God, of how God has shaped and formed them as a people. It was also theological because it reminded them of sin and of God's judgment of sin, but also of God's mercy, grace, and forgiveness of sin. Through confession, repentance, there was an opportunity for thanksgiving. It was an opportunity for generosity and responding to that great love of God. But it was also typological, meaning that it was a type, that it looked forward to something. It wasn't just simply ritual and repetition that they would gather, and it's just something we do every year because we've always done it every year, and we should keep doing it every year. It was not meaningless, but it anticipated, actually, even in the moment, a looking forward to a greater fulfillment of all of these things. Now, let me try to tie this together for us. All of these things involved rest and worship and sacrifice, but they all pointed to Jesus. Jesus, who is the Passover lamb, who purchased our salvation. Jesus, who is the bread of life, who was indeed without sin, Jesus as the first fruits of the resurrection that is to come. Jesus who has brought together Jew and Gentile into his church and into his kingdom, who's torn down the dividing wall of hostility, as Paul says in Ephesians, and made the two one people after his own self. Jesus who will gather his people at his return. And the scriptures talk about that time as being announced with trumpets. Jesus, who is not only our high priest, but who is the atoning sacrifice for sin. Jesus, who is preparing not a temporary place, but a final place of rest and of shelter forever. These are the things, as God appointed them, as annual reminders and celebrations of how he has acted on their behalf, looking forward to its greater fulfillment in the kingdom to come. And Jesus, who ushers in now that kingdom by himself, fulfilling all of these things. And while we are now not bound by any of the appointed feasts, I don't know when you last celebrated the Feast of Booths. When the last time I called everybody to worship with a trumpet or mark. But listen, because of Jesus, right, we also ourselves now, we have our own rhythms of communal celebrations that aren't so much commanded necessarily in the same way, but they are communal celebrations where we gather as the people of God to center our lives on Jesus, who fulfilled all of these things. The author and perfecter of our faith. Doesn't that bring kind of fuller meaning to the sense of the term? The one who perfected the faith, the one who authored it. So what are those things that we do? Well, look, we gather together weekly to celebrate in communal worship. Like, one of the beautiful things about singing together, and I'm not going to remember this quote exactly, but I've tried to tell you this before, but anyway, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who's called perhaps one of the greatest theologians of the 21st century, or 20th century, sorry, Dietrich Bonhoeffer once said something along these lines: why is it that Christians sing together? Why do we do that? And his answer is, so that we together, with one voice, can proclaim the praises of God. It's so together we can state in unison of how good God is, of the story of God, that we can tell of his greatness and of his mighty acts, so that we together as a community of faith can be reminded of the one that we worship. That's part of why we sing together. And it is of praise to God who loves us, where we honor him. And again, as Jesus reminds us, not just with our lips, but with our lives as well. And so we gather weekly, communally, to worship, to sing, to hear the words of God spoken, to be taught the way of Jesus. We gather to pray together so that we can care for one another in that way and making those requests known to God. These kinds of gathering together as the people of God help shape and form us as his people. Which is why there's so much of the lifeblood of the church. It's why it's so important that we do gather together, so we are not adrift alone by ourselves trying to figure it all out. No, we were meant to be brought into the life of community and the community of God's people. And that's part of why we gather regularly. But there's also the annual events that take place. And I know for some of us as Protestants, we don't typically, for some of these things, we kind of have a loose connection with, right? We think about things like Lent what is it, Shrove Tuesday or Pancake Tuesday, we call it. There's Ed Stetzer, who's a church sociologist, pastor, teacher at Talbot School of Theology. Anyway, he once put on Facebook, he says, this is the beginning of Lent on Lenten Wednesday. He says, but for Baptists, it's just Wednesday. That's what he... right, so for the rest of the... Anyway... you can just forget that last 30 seconds. But the season of Lent is really the beginning of the season of Easter, right? And it's typically Lent is meant to be a time of reminder, of repentance, and of going without and of fasting as part of the rhythm of preparing ourselves for Easter. And then we have the Easter celebration. When we have Palm Sunday, and then we kind of work through the week, and we'll have a special communion celebration, a reminder of that Last Supper that Jesus had. We get to kind of Good Friday and we reflect on the cross, and then Easter Sunday is the celebration of the resurrection, and so Easter is part of that annual celebration. And then again, Ascension and Pentecost, we might reference them. We're not kind of, not that they're bad things to be reminded of, but they're usually not as exciting for us as Easter, but probably should be in terms of our reflection, where we remember 40 days after his resurrection, Jesus rose to heaven, right? He went back to the Father, and then 10 days after that was Pentecost, which again is that 7-week time between Passover and the feasting. It's all part of it, right? Jesus ascended and was in heaven, and the Spirit was given on day 50, 7 weeks later. It's patterned after all these feasts. Ascension, Pentecost, and then we find our way into Advent, to Christmas, all of those regular celebrations annually of things we're reminded of. Why? Because they retell the story again and again and again of what God has done. And then we have a couple practices as well that we note, and one of those we celebrated just a couple, what was it, the 20th, the last Sunday, baptism. Right? Where we have the opportunity, again, to be reminded that we are dead to sin, alive to Christ. Right? And when we baptized 5 people last Sunday, that was a celebration of the salvation story of God in that person's life, but also a reminder for all of us who were there of our own salvation. Baptism is one of those practices, and others communion. Or every once in a while, right? It's usually the first Sunday of the month, it's the last Sunday of the month this month. It's okay. It's as often as you do it. It doesn't have to be on a specific day. As often as we gather around the table, as often as we do this, we do it in remembrance of Jesus. That's what he told us to do. It's in remembrance of him. Why? Because his life, death, resurrection is at the heart of our faith. It is the story of how God is saving the world. And every time we gather around this table, we're reminded, and not only reminded of, but we together again in this way proclaim, state, speak without using words. Right? We proclaim what? His death until he comes again. We're reminded as we gather around the table, as we take part in communion, of what Christ has done for us. It is a festival. It is a feast. It is a part of our regular rhythm because it again tells the story of God who loved us, who gave himself for us. And as we, are part of festivals throughout the summer or whatever those might be, as we together as the church, as the people of God, gather, every time it is a celebration of who God is and what he has done for us. And so this morning, just as we conclude, we're going to gather around the table. And I just want to give you an opportunity as we kind of prepare ourselves for that. We'll give you an opportunity to kind of reflect, pray, just to pause, to think in the moment. If there's things that you need to repent of, we want to give you the space to do that, to confess to God, to give you the space to do that. If today your heart is stirred by what the Spirit is doing in this space, and you've yet to take that first step of faith to trust and follow Jesus, to admit your sin and to trust Jesus for the forgiveness of your sin, knowing that he died for your sin and was buried, that he rose again and was seen. If that's a first step of faith you need to take, you do that simply this morning, but just bowing your head and admitting that to God, believing Christ died for you and confessing him as Lord. That's the first step to a lifelong journey of trusting and following him who gave himself for you. And if you've taken that step, be reminded today as we gather around the table that as we eat the bread and drink of the cup, we center our lives once again on Christ and what he has done for us.